Hello and welcome back to the Developing Solutions with Sitecore Print Experience Manager video training series. In this video, we'll cover the PXM installation steps required for using PXM with InDesign Server. So, in addition to the previous PXM core configuration that we did, we're going to install a number of dependent services in order for PXM to talk to and queue jobs to InDesign Server. These include using MSMQ, or Microsoft Message Queuing, configuring PXM to use SMTP if required, as well as installing InDesign Server CC or CC 2014, and the Sitecore services, namely the InDesign Processing Service and the Print Studio Dashboard Server. After that, we'll install the optional PXM Online Document Generator component. So first off, ensure that MSMQ is installed. This is a service that's required in order for PXM to queue jobs that are sent to InDesign Server. You can see here it's in the Windows features, and it's simply a matter of enabling MSMQ with the defaults, which include the MSMQ server core. The other services are not necessary for PXM to operate correctly. Next, we'll look at installation of InDesign Server. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire installation process. It's fairly simple once you've downloaded it and install it. What I do want to look at, though, is a few specific configuration things that you need to know. First off, once InDesign Server is installed, launch the MSC document here, and you should see an InDesign Server service here at this point. If you do not see this, simply say New InDesign Server instance and set the port to 8081. If in fact you see an error somewhere in the screen, what that is it's related to the design or the installation of InDesign Server and the fact that this is an x64 installation, in which case you should launch a command line. Ensure to run as administrator, and in fact you should always be running as administrator in any sort of installation process that you're doing with PXM or Sitecore, and do a registration of the 64-bit version of that DLL. At this point, this will work, and you can now add a new InDesign Server instance and set the port to 8081. That's the first thing you need to do. The second thing is go to Services, and within Services go down to InDesign Server and look at the properties and ensure the logon is set to local system account and allow service to interact with desktop. This last point is key because the InDesign Server service needs to be able to write files to the file system, and so therefore it needs to be able to do both these things and set to that user. And once you've done both of those things, last thing is to test simply by going to localhost 8081, and you should see now a SOAP response coming back from InDesign Server. So at this point, InDesign Server is successfully installed, and then based upon those two configurations, setting the port and setting the proper user account to run the InDesign Server service as, it should now be ready for further installation steps in PXM. Now, next step after all of this is to install the plugin, the Sitecore PXM plugin on the InDesign Server instance. After that is done, you should have within InDesign Server plugins a Sitecore directory, and that's really all you need to do. This is much easier to find on the Sitecore dev portal because the automated document service, unlike the InDesign client connectors, there's no Mac version. This only runs on PC versions for InDesign Server. And secondly, there's no distinction between an x86 version and an x64 version. InDesign Server for a long time only installs to an x64 version. So therefore, your only real choice is, are you installing InDesign Server CC or InDesign Server CC 2014? After which point you download and run this install package, and it will simply add that plugin as necessary on your InDesign Server instance. Now the next two things we're seeing here for the automated document service are the dashboard service and the InDesign Server processing service. So we'll look at those and what that installs and what we need to configure after the fact. So again, for the sake of time, I'm skipping the portion where we download and actually install those two services. Suffice to say, they're very easy installs. Leave all the defaults as necessary, and they will install the InDesign processing service and the Print Studio dashboard server to program files x86 Sitecore. And again, I'm just going to focus on really what you need to know configuration-wise. You will also see those two appear in the services on your Windows server as well. So first and foremost, let's take a look at the Print Studio dashboard server. You can see here there is a configuration file within there, so let's look at that. And also there's a configuration file in the processing service. And of course I have the sitecore.printstudio.config from the PXM installation in our app config include directory. And so these are the three files, and there's a few things that you need to change. First and foremost, we saw in the first part of the installation, and I'll mention it here one more time, you updated the projects folder to reflect the location of your Sitecore instance. Second thing is ensuring that you have your InDesign server name set correctly. And the last is ensuring that you have your Print Studio dashboard queue name set correctly. So here I have mine set to InDesign Server CC. If you look at my InDesign processing service here, I have my service version and my queue name is here InDesign Server, and my service version is CC 2014. You need to make sure that all of these line up correctly so that your queue name that's coming from Sitecore and it's passing information into your MSMQ queue, it's doing so under this name. The InDesign processing service is retrieving information from a queue under this name, and so you need to make sure that those versions line up. Otherwise, those services will, Sitecore will be writing to one queue, and your InDesign processing service will be reading from another queue, which is not ideal. And so we're going to go through and line those up such that we're all using the correct CC 2014 version, because that is what we installed. So let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so first and foremost, let's make sure that our service version is set correctly. So we are using InDesign Server CC 2014. If we were just simply using CC, we would remove the .2014, but we are using CC 2014, and so we'll take that value and we'll go to our Print Studio config, and we're going to update this server name to reflect that. Secondly, the print dashboard queue. Now, the InDesign server name, this actually reflects the name and version of the application that we're calling. So this is very specific, has to be correct to the version of InDesign server that you are using. Your print dashboard queue name does not, however, it does need to be consistent between the two. So here in my InDesign processing service, I've been running PXM and older versions for a long time. I just tend to keep InDesign Server as my queue name to avoid having to change it through upgrades. And in this case here, in my Print Studio config in my Sitecore instance, I will change it to reflect that name as well. So at this point here, we now have our MSMQ dashboard queue name of InDesign Server. Sitecore will be writing to the InDesign Server queue, and in my processing service, it will be reading from the InDesign Server queue. And so it's reading and writing from the same queue, which is what we want. Excellent. Similarly, when we're calling the application, we're ensuring that we're calling CC 2014, and our queue is also doing the same thing. Last but not least, for SMTP configuration, you can configure an SMTP server to send emails to, as well as defining what the email address of those sendings is coming to, and you can send set an email notification as well, so you receive copies of those things. The dashboard server is fairly easy to configure. There are some PXM Publishing directories which we will configure and ensure they're correctly configured after we unpack this directory and install that. But the defaults are typically good and accurate. If you've made changes to these, ensure once again you go back to the services and restart the service. And again, if you want to test this, you can do so and ensure that the dashboard web service is successfully running and being called. Okay, last step is to set up a location for PXM Publishing directory. And what this directory is basically a place for InDesign Server to write files to, as well as containing things like fonts that are used within publications, as well as imagery that's used within publications. Now, there is a little bit of a quirk in that the installation for this zip file is not on the Sitecore Developer Portal. It is, however, on the Sitecore Developer Network, the older one. So if you go to Adaptive Print Studio 1.4, Update 3, and download, you'll see here that there is a APS publishing.zip that's needed for the automated document service. And so that is this file here. And when we extract that, we're going to extract it and actually call that PXM publishing.zip. And so what you'll have here on the hard drive is this directory, PXM Publishing. And so a little bit of explanation here. Again, it's any fonts that you're using for some of the Silverlight applications, they go here. High-res images, low-res images go here. More importantly, this is where you have logs for your processing services. So your dashboard server logs, your InDesign processing server logs, the image processing service if you are using that, again, for the Silverlight applications. And last but not least, your publish folder. This is where output from InDesign Server is created. And that's important to know because you need to ensure that you have security on that such that InDesign Server can write to that. Now, in cases where you're installing InDesign Server to a separate machine, or these PXM Publishing files can exist on a separate machine as well. So this is not something that needs to be installed on the Sitecore server or specifically on the InDesign server. It can be somewhere third. In our case here for the demo, we are installing everything on one machine, but this is often something that you can install elsewhere, so long as both Sitecore and the Sitecore services, as well as InDesign Server, have the permission to write to that directory. So that's what you're going to do. You're going to take that zip file, extract that somewhere, call that PXM Publishing. Now, once that has been extracted, again, we need to go back to our configuration files and make sure that the log folder and and publishing folder locations are set correctly. So we can see here, this is C PXM Publishing logs. Great, and the service has the permission to write to that. Similarly, the dashboard server service also is writing to C PXM Publishing logs. Print Studio itself is putting a cache in C PXM Publishing. Now, the last location that you need to potentially change and update is that of the publish folder, and that is going in Sitecore itself. So again, if we look at our Sitecore installation, we'll go and we'll take a look at that setting, and also make sure that that setting is published to the web database, because of course when you're initiating publishing jobs from the web database, it's going to look at the web database for the source of that configuration, which is coming from a Sitecore item. So again, that is under Content Editor. And Print Studio, and App Settings, and URL Settings. So if you're updating the publish paths here, you'll need to change that and publish out this item if you have made a change. Similarly for the image store as well. Now, one thing here, we're seeing low resolution versions, localhost low resolution images, localhost high resolution images. This is something that you can optionally configure as necessary in order to ensure that the low res and high res directory in that PXM Publishing folder is viewable from Sitecore. That's really, and same with the publish paths. You see a path here. This is an optional setting such that when you do publish and send out a link to that file, that link is going to have the publish path of this location. So localhost may work here, but if we're configuring PXM in a distributed environment, so somebody in one location is using the online document generator, for example, localhost probably doesn't make sense to them. So this is something that you would need to change here to be a URL that makes sense in the context of how PXM is actually being deployed. And so those are the three locations really. So you're looking at Print Studio config, making sure PXM Publishing is set there. Dashboard server is setting logs there. InDesign processing service is setting logs there. And Sitecore itself, you're changing a number of these items, and if you are changing those, publishing those out. So once again, these aren't the installation instructions start to finish. There are a few other things that we've sort of skipped over. What I've simply done here is gone over the overview of the installation of InDesign Server and those services, and particularly pointing out a lot of those areas where people run into trouble on installations. So again, take that installation document, follow it start to finish, and this video is really just highlighting those things that are interdependencies, as well as those things that often cause issues for installation. Now that we've done that, so we've installed InDesign Server, we've installed MSMQ, which we use for the queuing, and we've installed those dashboard services and the processing service, which really allows Sitecore to queue up those requests and send those to InDesign Server and receive the output. And also, importantly, for the dashboard service waits for a callback from InDesign Server. So once that job is completed, and we can even see this here in Sitecore, we have these message settings that you can have an email sent when that processing by InDesign Server is complete. And so those are really those interdependencies there. Now that we've done all that, we're going to install the online document generator, which exists on top of these services. Again, we'll go where we normally go, to the control panel, and we'll select install a package, and we will either choose the online document generator or we will upload it and run through the installation here. So when that's complete, again, we'll just restart the Sitecore client. Now when you go to the dashboard homepage, you'll see two additional items representing the online document generator. So we have two additional icons. We have the Design Manager icon and we have the Document Publisher icon. The Design Manager is really an administration interface, and this allows us to create collections. And similarly here we can see active collections. A collection is similar to something like an advertising campaign or something like a specific use case. So you may have collections around brochures or business cards or storefront collateral. It allows you three things. First, to define what users have the ability to access documents within that collection. It allows you to define content to select within that collection, and also start and end dates for that. We're going to go through the online document generator separately, so I'll skip that. I just wanted to show you this for the install. And then similarly, the document publisher allows you to select documents within a collection and publish them, and then that sends those documents to InDesign Server for generation. So now that we have that, we've installed all the PXM core components, and you've gone to the effort of installing all those additional PXM server components for automation with InDesign Server. We're now going to go back to our use cases and install the content and start to focus on the design, and we'll actually start to get into the details of PXM and development on PXM.